Hello again. My name is Mark Seymour. I'm a tour guide. I work with Rick Steves and I run my own travel company based here in Great Britain. Also do some touring in Brittany in Western France. So today's episode is a follow-on from our last one where I visited the stones in Karnak. Today I'm going to take you up to visit a site that's very special to me, Saint-Just. Saint-Just, Saint-Just, you can pronounce it how you will. Beautiful place. It's a ridge that runs essentially from east to west across the middle part of Brittany. And geologically it's very interesting. It's schist, fractured stone to you and I. It looks fractured, it is fractured, and it was used by our forefathers because it was fractured. And in the video that's explained to you. Tony and I, we walk along the ridge. We visit and look at some of the little sites en route. Some fabulous tombs. There are some great stone alignments. I do my best to explain them to you. And I hope I raise a few questions in your mind. There's been a lot of mythology, as I said before, about standing stones and what they are, what they represent. Fortunately for me, my sphere of influence is the stones here in Brittany, where the archaeology is a lot more complete than it is certainly in the British Isles. They have more stones, and as I've already said, many of the words used to describe stones come from Brittany and Breton archaeologists, dolmen, menhir, tumuli, tumulus, etc. Now, what I try to do as I go through these sites on these tours, this is a virtual tour of Saint-Just and, of course, of Monteneuve. Monteneuve is the second site that I visit. You'll see 2/3 of the way through this episode, you'll see that we change location. We visit Monteneuve, which is a beautiful, beautiful site, very atmospheric. But much of what I try to do on these little documentaries is to explain to you some of the misconceptions, to explain to you some of the known facts. There are a few of them about these great places. But I do want you to ask questions. I want you to understand a little bit more about them yourselves, and I am here to answer your questions. If you have any questions to ask me, please shoot a message at me, shoot an email at me. Please feel free to subscribe both to my Facebook page and to my blog. You'll find links from my Facebook page through to the blog. And as I said in the last video, I'm doing these at my own expense, my own cost, and at the moment, of course, there is no work. As a tour guide, we are out of work, at least until next year. Hopefully things will change then, and Rick Steve's buses and my buses will be back up and running. I'm thinking the small group buses will definitely be up and running in the spring. I'm making plans to that end. But if you would care to donate, some of you already have donated very, very graciously to help the running costs and the production costs of these short videos. Thank you again for having done that. From the bottom of my heart, thank you very much indeed. If anybody else would like to donate, there are links. There is one on my Facebook post regarding this episode. There's also one on the YouTube page where you'll find this episode. All you've got to do is look down underneath the tiny little arrow underneath this video. If you click on that, you'll see the text description of the site, and then there's a PayPal link where you can donate if you wish. And thank you for doing so in advance. Much appreciated, very much appreciated indeed. There will be another episode. At the moment, Loch Mariacare, which is a beautiful site with an exhibition centre over on the coast, is closed because of the COVID-19 virus. However, it should open over the next week or two, and when it does, I will get over there and do another episode of that, which will round off very nicely the whole idea of standing stones in Brittany. And I'll also be moving on to chateaux, to manoirs, to villages, to fortified towns, to the salt marshes and the salt flats. I'll be talking about Brittany. There are some fabulous towns here in Brittany, such as Van and Rennes, Saint-Malo. We'll pay a visit to some of those in due course. So stick with it, stick with the program, as we say. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and as I say, I appreciate your feedback. So this morning we've come up to a place that I love, another stone site It's called Saint Just, or to you and I, Saint Just. Well, of course it's the other way around, isn't it? Because we're in France now and you're still in the States in all probability, somewhere English speaking. But here anyway, you can see the scale of the stones here. This is schist. Here on this ridge, on this outcropping, the stones appear made of schist. Back there in Karnak, remember the first video, they're made of granite. And of course those of you familiar with Avebury and Stonehenge, there the stone is made of sarsen. Different geology essentially. Here up on the ridge, and this is a ridge, it's called Landelanvaux, a ridge that runs east-west, pretty much through the centre of Brittany. The schist outcropping is marvellous. It's essentially a large fault, geological fault, and the stone along this ridge is broken, allowing many minerals to be formed within the various layers of rock strata here. And you can see the white stone, or white and grey stone over there. The white is actually quartz. We'll see some more of that in a little while, but I want you to have a look at this as I pan around. This is a part of this great site of Saint Just. The stones here are quite remarkable, probably chosen for their shape as much as anything. We think that is quite common practice amongst our megalithic forefathers. They would choose stones for their shape as opposed to cutting or carving them. The only exception there again is Stonehenge. They very clearly have cut the stones to enable the mortise and tenon joints, which would enable them to build cross stones, cross beams essentially. But most stone sites don't have that. That's a, shall we say, a recent innovation. Stonehenge being one of the younger stone circles in Britain, if not the youngest. But here we have quite an array of some beautiful stones. Now, I'm going to cut across the grass here so that you can see how large they are. And again, you can see they are of different colours. There's another quartz one there, and one beyond it over there. And here, this is almost like a flame, isn't it? The French would probably call it an oriflamme. Beautiful, beautiful stone. But again, if I close in, you can see the geology quite clearly. So here the strata is in an up and down pattern on the rock itself. Well, what I mean there is the rock is standing upright, but the strata itself should have been that way around. Now we're going to move on through this site because there are some very special things to show you. It's not just a simple line of standing stones. It's on a ridge, and in this part of France you find windmills. Of course this one's actually been converted into a residence. But it's a beautiful part of the world, and I want you to understand that these stones indicate something. Now our Breton archaeologist friends tend to believe that these have nothing to do with celestial bodies. It's very much a British invention. They have more to do with waypoints and markers across the landscape. And in fact, if I look up, if I point the camera across the fields and the hills in the distance, you can see a cleft in the hill. I know that there's actually a row of stones that go from this point right up through the valley and over the top of that ridge. Likewise, if I pan around very quickly, likewise up past the windmill, down into the valley on the other side, there are more stones. In fact, there are a number of alignments that come together here. this point here at Saint-Just. And what is quite interesting is that these stones are, mineralogically speaking, different. So as we follow the trail, we are heading towards another parcel of this site. This is a vast area as well. Karnak, remember, about 4.5 kilometers from east to west. This particular site is more of a loop. There's a river in that direction, and we're heading over towards that, following this trail, very well marked out. But let's get up onto a little waypoint for you to have a look, see where we are. Quite a high point, and you can see we're now on top of that ridge that I spoke about. This is where the rock is faulted, and you can see this is schist right underneath us here, in amongst the gorse and the bracken. The hills of Brittany off to the west of us and to the south of us. Over there in the valley there is still a quarry, and it's a quarry where they still take this stone out of the ground today. And strangely enough, in Brittany it's become fashionable again to have standing stones in your front and back gardens, so why not come to this particular location and take a stone away with you, just as our forefathers did 6,000 years ago. Now look at the schist. This would have been prized out of the ground quite simply. You can see the very clear stratification here, facing to the sky. Our forefathers would find a weak spot in amongst that stone, in amongst that strata, and they would wedge timbers into it, possibly heating it or setting fire to the timbers, but more likely they would wedge the timbers in, and then they would pour water into those timbers to make them expand. And in the process of expanding, the timbers would crack some of this stone off, literally shearing it off, at which point then they could drag them off to various locations all over the countryside. I want to take this opportunity to show to you how this rock strata lies here on this ridge. Just to point it out more clearly, it's one thing seeing it on a wet rock in the countryside, but when you see the strata laying down on the ground, you'll understand what I mean. You can see very clearly the grooves running along this piece of rock outcropping. And if I were to bring a timber and wedge it into a crevasse like this or like this, hammering it down, and then pour water into the end of the timber would expand, and in so doing it would force these layers of rock apart. And that's exactly what our forefathers were looking for, pieces of this rock that could be sheared off and hauled away to another location. Here for a reason. We've been following the trail. We've got about a kilometre and a half through this site so far, and along this ridge there are these ponds. It is fresh water, it's very brackish, but it's fresh water. And what's very interesting to archaeologists is the fact that these were lined with clay. There are a number of them, and they were lined with clay. So they're called ancient quarries. They are very ancient, perhaps as much as 6,000 years of age. But if a pool is lined with, if a recess is lined with clay, it's to hold water. And it's interesting, even today, water is retained within these pools. So why would they do that? You may remember from the first video, when we were back in Karnak, that I mentioned this feature. Breton archaeologists believe that these stones, some of them at least, were waypoints. Some of them were shaped and chosen to point in a certain direction, perhaps to enable travel. And under some of the more significant ones, you would find a pool filled with water. What purpose could that serve? Well, I often say, think about our 17th and 18th century forefathers. They had the benefit of horses and carriages, and they'd be travelling across the English landscape, the British landscape, the American heartland,
and they'd need to rest the horses. And we've developed the whole idea of wayside inns, lodges and pubs. Well, don't you think that this could possibly be something similar? People moving their animals across ancient trackways and needing refreshment for themselves and for their animals, particularly at night. Let's have a look at something just around the corner. We're going to walk away from the pond and we're going to go literally just 10 feet. Through the trees, it's a little bit wet today. There is actually another pond on my right hand side, much smaller, but it nestles underneath these great stones. Useful great quartz stones. Again, quartz naturally develops in the geology here. I've already pointed some other examples out. Beautiful quartz stones. There are actually some smaller ones following the lower part of the ridge, and some of these massive ones dotted around the hillside. These were erected by our forefathers 6,000, 6,500 years ago. And remember the significance of the ponds next to them. Again, no celestial stars. They don't talk about alignments here with the skies or with the galaxies or the universes. They don't talk about solstices and harvests, although certainly people would have celebrated those things, as we do still today. But were these significant because of those events? Quite probably not. However, never say never. Until science proves that they were significant in that way, let's just say not. Okay, keep on walking. We're following the trail, moving away from the white quartz, and I want to show you something very, very special. Come with me. Okay, so this is what I wanted to show you here this morning. On top of the ridge, 3500 BC, this is firmly in Brittany's Bronze Age. The transition between the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, and the Bronze Age has begun. The people who created this were already now using metals, bronze. This is what we today call a tomb. It's built encompassing some very large standing stones. In fact, some of the largest standing stones here on this ridge. And you can see they've almost been swallowed up. You can see the large white quartz and schist stones. And then you can see the piles of rubble, essentially, that have been built around it. What that is a square-shaped passage grave. As I say, 3500 BC, so 5,500 years of age, whereas the stones are 6,000 to 6,500 years of age. One or more individuals were buried in the tomb, a single passage going into a square room. And it would have looked a little bit like this. You have the passage, upright stones supporting slabbed roof. 1, 2, 3, 4 slabs roof. Going into two small square chambers inside or encompassed by a large pile of rubble. Stacked rubble, stacked stone. So a nice, beautifully impressive tomb here on what is quite an exposed site. Nowadays we have the trees all the way around us. This is the top of a ridge. So this person, were they important or not, is irrelevant. This person was placed in an important place. On top of the ridge where the stone was supplied to local communities all over what we now call Brittany. You can almost imagine them trading in this material, shipping it off by the quarry load to other communities elsewhere, such as in Karnak. But whoever this person was, whoever these people were buried in this tomb, we can assume that they were fairly important. I think that's fair to say. Simple structure, a simple Bronze Age tomb, nestled in amongst Neolithic stones on top of this ridge. Now, today you can't see it, but underneath the grass in front of us there are also some Iron Age graves, single person graves, individuals buried under a single slab stone. Iron Age, 800 BC up until the arrival of the Romans. So we have a succession of periods here. We have the Neolithic, 7,500 to 6,000 BC. We have the Bronze Age, going from the end of that period right up to the beginning of the Iron Age, 800 BC. Very, very important site because we see reusage of archaeology very clearly in the fact that the stones have been built over and engulfed by the Bronze Age cairn. Now, Tony, my wife and I, as we explore this ridge on your behalf, I want to point something out to you. Right across the ridge, there is a track. The trackway is what we would call it in British archaeology. And you can see it follows the ridge. You can see I have views on either side of us, out across the Breton countryside. This is to the south. We're walking west. The trackway is coming down off the ridge. It's walking to something also rather special, but I want to point out and let you understand more about these trackways. This is not a recent invention. There were communities, obviously, living and working in this area thousands of years ago. And they, of course, just like we do today, they had to be able to transport themselves, their goods, their livestock from point A to point B across the landscape. And these trackways are very important, particularly in the British Isles. Those of you who have travelled with me will remember me talking about the right to roam and the public footpaths. Most, if not all, but most of those public footpaths, even today, are based upon the old trackways, the ancient trackways. It is in large part thanks to those ancient trackways that connected communities thousands of years ago, because they existed when the Anglo-Saxons arrived in 4, 5, 6, 7, 800 AD. They arrived, they found use for these trackways, and they enshrined them in law that people had the right to use them unhindered. The right to roam was born courtesy of that Saxon age, and it's born because of these ancient trackways. And it's so nice, it's so lovely to see so many of them still here in Western Brittany today. In a moment you'll see where this particular one leads us. You can see we're heading up there towards that tall cedar tree. So we're still on the ridge, we're underneath the tall poplar tree, and in a rock outcropping here there are a number of these tombs, essentially passage graves, of different ages, essentially from about 3500 BC up until about 1000 BC. So again, this area you reuse over and over again. Reusage of archaeology. You hear me talking about this a lot, but when you think about it, stone is a material that can be used over and over and over. So this was a tomb. This is very similar to the one we saw in the previous clip, only the other one was covered in stone, a pile of rubble. This will have been as well. You can see the entrance there, the passage. See the large stones, the uprights that would have supported a stone roof. And then you see the circular enclave where human remains were deposited, again with a roof, and then again with a large pile of rubble over the top of it. Remains of a dolmen. Lovely Breton word, dolmen, D-O-L-M-E-N. Means nothing more than a tomb, quite probably in this part of the world, a passage tomb. Right next to the passage tomb we have a kist burial, C-Y-S-T. You can call that cyst burial, it doesn't matter. A kist burial to archaeologists. This is very simple. This is a small cut in the ground. Again, those of you who have travelled with me have heard me talk about these as we travel through areas like Avebury and Cornwall. Small cut in the ground, nothing more than the lining of that little cut, that little trench, lined with larger stones with a capstone over the top. In fact, when I take people up to Maryvale on Dartmoor, I show you examples of these. There are hundreds of them on that particular location. And there's one particular one where the capstone is still in place, but miners have actually cut that capstone in two, removed half of it, the middle half, and you can peer into the last resting place of one of our forefathers. A kist burial, a dolmen, and another dolmen. A dolmen, another passage grave here on the very ridge. First of all, there's the cedar tree. Not that that had any import to our fathers because it didn't exist, but here's a very long passage grave. You can see the row of stones there on the right, and then you can see there's a reciprocal row of stones on the left. And this grave site is all of the interior, and at the far end you can see a very large end stone. Now as I move along to another feature here on the landscape, there's the large end stone. I'm going to walk down to another passage grave. I'm walking through a bog here, by the way, so if I'm breaking in and out sound-wise, excuse me. I'm walking through a marsh. And this is what that other one that we just looked at would have looked like. You can see the large uprights. You can see the passage grave, the passage. Uprights that will have supported capstones. These will have supported capstones. Human remains inside. And then a large cairn, a large pile of rubble built up over the top of it. And I know some of you saw this feature in the background. We're heading over there now. There's the tomb that we were just looking at. I'm just going to pan around and you can see this single stone right there. Let's call that one the accused. I'm going to pan around further. And these white quartz stones, they're all in a horseshoe shape actually, facing the accused. And locally they call them the judges. Got to give these things a name, haven't you? Yes, another very large, was probably a burial site, a passage grave in all probability. So a lot of it left. We know it was an oblong shape, just like the one we saw a moment ago. And again, just to underline, these stones are everywhere here. What's hiding in amongst those trees, I wonder? Farmers let trees grow because there's bad ground underneath it. And look, there's a stone sentinel looking down on us from above. A passage grave or a simple kist burial. This is sort of a bit of both. Funerary practices changed, not just from time to time, but actually from location to location. It became fashionable to cremate your dead. It became fashionable to disarticulate your dead. It became fashionable to inter them in an urn. It became fashionable just to lay them at rest in a place such as this. These things changed and very often came back again. But here somebody was buried. You can see how large it is. This is the capstone, sort of thing that I've been talking about. There's an entrance where you are. You would come in through that side, small passage, coming down into a cut in the ground. I'm actually in a cut in the ground. These upright stones would have supported more of these capstones, creating a roof. And over the whole thing would be a circular pile of stones. Remember that, circular pile of stones. Some of you have been to Cairns in Scotland, where you have several of these cairns, burial sites. And it's very clear that there are stones radiating out the center of the pile of rubble. Simple. It's a building method that would help them retain that rubble and stop it from slipping and moving away. As the seasons go by, that pile of rubble will flatten out, it'll move down the hillside and away from the stone side. They knew that. So they would very often have your uprights here, put a circular row of uprights all the way around it, a retaining wall, if you will, spokes of the wheel, more uprights going out to that retaining wall, and then they'd fill the whole thing in with rubble. When that started to move away after perhaps hundreds or even 1,000 or so years, another circular perimeter of uprights and more spokes radiating out. And that's what you see at Clavercairns in Scotland, in Aberdeenshire. It's the sort of thing that we see here in this area from time to time. We've just seen a similar example of that at the dolmen, the circular dolmen that we've just left. This is a good example as to the construction types used and the techniques used. Uprights, large slabs protecting whoever's buried inside, and a pile of rubble over the top. Building technique used for 3,000 years. Okay, so we've come to the end of our morning's foray to this wonderful site at Saint-Just. I love this place. Some friends referred me to this location 8 years ago now, and I've been coming back ever since. There's so much to learn, and the archaeology is changing every day. Science is changing our archaeology. You've heard me say this before. But this is where the trail ends here at Saint-Just. You can see there's a chateau, or as we say here in this part of Norway, manoir, off to my left, to your right as you're looking at it. And behind me and underneath me is the river, it's the Vilaine, and it essentially goes from north of Brittany all the way to the south of Brittany. Beautiful section of water. The pathway ends here, the geology ends here. Across the river, everything changes, and we're going across the river, and the next portion of this video will be at Montneuve.
Now, having finished our tour of Saint-Just, I'll pronounce it the English way, Saint-Just, we followed the ridge from east to west. The Landeland Vaux, as that ridge is called. We've gone from east to west. We are now going to take a short drive, a 30-minute drive from Saint-Just to Montneuve, M-O-N-T-E-N-E-U-F, Montneuve. Small village. There's so many of those in Brittany. It's a beautiful place to live. And on the outskirts of the village there are arrays of standing stones, lots of them, about 450, 500, they keep finding more in the forest, you've heard me say that before, at Carnac. Many of them, and 65 or 70 are standing in one particular enclave, which I'll be taking you to on this particular tour. I want you to think about what I've just said. Here in Western France we have a huge number of standing stones. I must have said that a dozen times. They're found here in Western France because in large part France, this part of France has remained very isolated. Much of it is wilderness, much of it is unfarmable, not wanted by farmers throughout the ages. So not particularly valuable. Some of the coastal areas certainly were because of the salts, but here inland, no. So the stones have survived. They haven't been farmed over, they haven't been quarried out, and they have survived. And that's significant. I do use the word "let's visit a site" a lot. That's not intended. That's a faux pas on my behalf, because archaeology now is trying to get away from that concept. Sites like Newgrange in Ireland, sites like Stonehenge, sites like Carnac. There's no site about it. The whole of the landscape of Western Europe was covered, like a bad case of the measles, was covered in these great stone structures. So to think of them in modern terms as a site here and a site there just doesn't do the scale of this justice. The whole of the Western Isles, the whole of the coastal areas of Western Europe, much of the hinterland of Western Europe were covered in hundreds of thousands of standing stones, most of which have been ploughed out, taken away and quarried, broken down for building rubble. So bear that in mind as we wander through the stones, and keep that to the front of your mind. We'll come back to that later.
So we've just arrived at Monteneuve. A beautiful array of stones. These are made of material that we call purple quartz or purple schist. Combination of both, therefore. There are approximately 450 stones in this site. Only about 65 or so of which are standing right here in this enclave today. Once again, very different from what we've already seen both at Karnak and up there this morning up at Saint Just. These are very impressive, and I can tell you that in the daylight, when the sun is shining and these stones have actually dried out, these stones do radiate a sort of purplish glow. Courtesy of the geology and the mineralogy, but very impressive indeed. You can see a lot of them are lying down. Why do we find so many stones lying down on the terrain? Well, a number of reasons why. If you have sheep grazing in an area where there are a lot of stones, you'll find that they will keep the grass so cut that they actually undercut stones, which will then eventually literally get blown over or fall over. And of course, historically, many stones would be pulled over in religious communities, of which most of Europe were part of various religious communities at various points in time. You have people who would come out to these stones and think it would be an absolute hoot to pull them over, pull them into a hole that they had already prepared, and they would bury the stones. And in sites like this, it's quite interesting. There are a lot of stones lying down in amongst the trees here, amongst the other stones in this enclave. But in Britain, you find in places like Avebury, Stonehenge, for mile after mile after mile, we're constantly finding new stones, courtesy of ground penetrating radar and LiDAR. We find stones that have been buried, deliberately buried by our ancestors. There's some lovely stories to tell about some of them as well. Very famous Barbara Surgeon stone there at Avebury. So this is, again, this is Monteneuve, M-O-N-T-E-N-E-U-F. It's a beautiful site. It is quite surreal. It's one of those sites that has a lot of atmosphere. Today, oddly enough, we have a lot of children running around, but we'll try and avoid them. But you can see scale is everything. Stones are very impressive. Up to about 40 ton in weight. Very dense, very compact material. Today this site is used by schools. They bring a lot of children out here and they talk about the technology of the stones, and by that I mean architectural devices used to erect the stones on site. And in a minute I'll show you exactly how that was done. So a very, very atmospheric site. I do love Monteneuve. I really don't get here enough. Stones at every angle you can possibly imagine. And as I say, very happy to say, it's popular among school children. And we're truly walking amongst the stones. Okay, so this area we've just come into now, this is essentially a reconstruction. They're showing you how stones were moved, how they were erected, and giving us an idea as to the technologies used by our forefathers 6,500 years ago, 6,000 years ago. Actually right up until really, well, let's say when the Romans arrived. You want to move a big stone, there's only so many ways you can do it. I will say, don't think about man hours. If you go and do your Wikipedia search and your Google search, they'll talk about millions of man hours building Avebury and building Carnac. Don't think about man hours. These were farmers. They had beasts of burden just like we still do today. So let's get into this. Let's talk about how this was done. Straight line across the countryside. But if you come across an obstacle, what do you do? Simple. Human ingenuity. You can use timbers. Use larger logs as a fulcrum, and you can literally lift these rocks up and over any obstacles that may come across. Now, in the same way, when these stones come to the final resting place and need to be erected, you would cut out just a little kist, a little hole in the ground. You put the spoil heap to one side of the kist, perhaps with some logs in front of that, and then you would pull the rock up over those logs, up over that little spoil heap, until the end of it is hanging over the small hole in the ground that you've created. Then again, using your ropes to pull the rock and levers to push the rock into place, you just pull and push until it just drops and slots into a hole probably no more than 1.5 feet deep. That's all it would take for a stone of 15-20 tons. Certainly a bigger hole if you have one such as we have at Stonehenge and Avebury, 120 tons. But still, we're not talking about great depth. Once you have the stone upright, you would then use a lot of that rubble fill that you've taken out of the ground to pack in underneath the stone to wedge it into place, and that will hold the stone upright. Very simple, very clever, and I say, it's a technique that allowed many of these stones to stand in place for thousands of years.
So thanks again for watching. Our stroll through the stones for today at least is over. I hope you join me on the next one. As I say, we'll be visiting Loch Mariacare and one or two other sites here in my region, my beautiful region of Brittany. Throw your questions at me through Messenger, and as I say, it'd be gratefully appreciated if you wish to donate. You will find the PayPal link underneath this YouTube screen. Underneath here, follow that little V, that little arrow, click on that, you'll see the description and you'll see a PayPal link. Click on that and donate whatever you wish, whatever it is. Thank you very, very much in advance. Take care, we look forward to seeing you soon. Bye bye.